Perseus, from Stories of Old Greece and Rome, public domain reading. When the wicked king, Dionysus, persuaded his daughters to kill their husbands on their wedding night, there was one, Hypermnestra, who refused to slay her lover, and by saving him brought upon the head of cruel Dionysus the doom that he had striven to escape. The grandson of Hypermnestra and Lynceus was Acrisus, the king of Argo, a kindly ruler who dearly loved his only daughter Danae, and kept her always near him to delight his eyes with her great beauty. Unfortunately, the king chanced to learn from an oracle that he would one day be killed by his grandson, and hoping to prevent this, he shut Danae in a high brazen tower, which no one was allowed to enter on pain of death. He placed around the tower a strong guard so that no one could even get a glimpse of the imprisoned princess. But though no mortal wooer could approach her, Danae's loveliness was not hidden from Jupiter's eyes, and as he looked down from high Olympus, he pitied the maiden's loneliness and loved her for her great beauty. Fearing to frighten her if he assumed any mortal disguise, and not daring to appear before her in his divine splendor, he took the form of a golden shower, which fell softly on the sill of the tower window, and charmed the lonely captive with its brightness. Each day this strange visitor came to glorify her darkened room, and Danae looked forward eagerly to its appearance. Thus, by means of the golden shower, Jupiter won the maiden's confidence and love, and spent many hours with her in the high tower room. Danae was not lonely anymore, but people who passed beneath her window could hear her singing to herself all day long. One morning the astonished attendants rushed to King Acrisus and told him that in the brazen tower was a mother and child. His daughter Danae had given birth to a son who was so beautiful that they called him Perseus. The king was enraged at this news and threatened to put the boy to death. But as he was unwilling to stain his hands with the blood of his grandson, even though this grandson might cause his own death, he put Danae and her infant in a cask and sent them adrift on the sea. For days the strange boat tossed about on the ever-rocking waves, and the poor frightened mother prayed to the gods to save her and her hapless child. Jupiter heard her cries, and no storms came to beat the frail boat upon the rocks, nor did any rough seas imperil the voyager's safety. At last the cask was washed gently up on the shores of the island of Seriphus, where a friendly fisherman rescued Danae, as well as her child, and took them to the king, Polydestus. This ruler received them kindly and allowed them to live at his court, and here the young Perseus grew into manhood, learning all the games and sports that belong to the training of a young Grecian youth. Meanwhile, Polydestus had become so enamored of Danae that he wished to marry her, and grew very angry at her continued refusals. His wrath was increased when Perseus forbade him to distress Danae any longer with his unwelcome attentions. As Polydestus did not dare to kill Perseus or banish him from the kingdom, for he knew that his suit would then be hopeless. He began to taunt the youth with his inexperience and asked him why he did not set out on some adventure to prove his mettle like other heroes. Perseus did not consider himself a hero, but he hoped someday to do great things, and the sneers of the king worked on his proud heart, as that wily old monarch had expected. The youth then demanded to have his courage and endurance put to the test, and Polydestus promptly told him to go and slay the Gorgon Medusa, and to bring her head back as proof of his valor. Perseus needed no urging to set out at once, though he well knew the danger of the undertaking. His mother implored him to remain with her, but the youth was determined not to endure Polydestus's taunts any longer, and he was eager to prove his bravery, even at the risk of his life. There were 3 of the Gorgons, all of them hideous to behold, but Medusa was by far the most terrible, for besides her frightful appearance, she had the power to turn those who looked at her into stone. She was once a beautiful maiden who had the misfortune to offend Minerva, and that goddess Minerva punished her, changing her into a dragon-like creature with long tusks, a scaly hide, brazen claws, and instead of hair, a writhing mass of serpents. To this monster Polydestus sent the young Perseus, feeling sure that he would never return home alive. The young hero had not journeyed far before he noticed that someone was walking beside him. Turning to look more closely at the stranger, he was at once surprised and frightened at recognizing Mercury. But the messenger of the gods bade him to have no fear, for he himself had come to help him in this perilous quest for the Gorgon's head. Then Mercury lent Perseus his own winged sandals, and told the youth that he would have to do some swift moving in the course of his adventures. The god also lent him a magic helmet that rendered the wearer invisible, and bade him offer thanks to Pluto as the sender of this invaluable gift. Not to be outdone by the other gods in kindness, the august Minerva lent Perseus her shield, the terrible Aegis of Jupiter, which the warrior goddess carried with her into battle. And thus equipped for the combat, Perseus had no fear of encountering the dread Medusa of the snaky locks, and pressed forward eagerly on his journey. He had already inquired of Mercury the way to the Gorgon's cave, but the god could not direct him and told him that he must find the Graeae and learn the way from them. The Graeae were 3 hideous old women who had been gray-haired from birth, and that was why they received their name. And they lived in a far-off land where eternal darkness reigned. They had only 1 tooth and 1 gigantic eyeball among them, and passed these around to each other in turn, as they alone could tell where Medusa dwelt. Perseus started northward on Mercury's winged sandals, and after flying for many days in search of the 3 sisters, he came at last to their cheerless land. He found the grey old women seated under a drooping willow tree that fell so far over them that it almost hid their shrunken forms. There sat the crones that had the single eye, clad in blue sweeping cloak and snow-white gown, while over their backs their straight white hair hung down, in long thin locks. Dreadful their faces were, carved all about with wrinkles of despair, and as they sat, they crooned a dreary song, complaining that their lives should last so long in that sad place that no one came anear, in that wan place desert of hope and fear. And singing still they rocked their bodies bent, and ever each to each the eye they sent. From William Morris, The Doom of King Acrisius. As Perseus approached the spot where the grey old women sat crooning to themselves, he took care to keep on his magic helmet, and he watched closely to see where the eye was being transferred from one old head to the other. Just as the eldest sister was taking out the great eye, and the one who was next in turn was holding out her shriveled hand to receive it, Perseus stepped quickly between them and snatched it away. The old woman began to grope for it in her pitiable blindness, and then arose a fierce dispute among the sisters as to who really had the eye. To end the quarreling, Perseus spoke gently to them, telling them that he had taken their treasured eye, and would return it to them as soon as they had informed him where to find Medusa of the snaky locks. For a while the grey old women pretended that they had never heard of Medusa, but finding that the unseen speaker was determined to keep their precious eye until he had received the desired information, they told him the way to the Gorgon's cave. Perseus then returned to them the huge eye, which seemed to stare at him with a very knowing look, and then he sped off on his winged sandals to the country where Medusa dwelt. As he flew among the sea coast, he saw in the distance a dark cavern among the rocks, and in front of it, on the glaring white sand, lay a monster, which even from his great height above the water, Perseus could not glance at without shuddering. Remembering Minerva's caution when she gave him her shield, he used its bright surface as a mirror in which were reflected all the objects below, and never once was he tempted to turn his eyes towards the dreadful figure on the beach. Its scaly hide glistened in the sunlight. Its brazen claws shone like live coals, and the snakes that lay coiled around its head shot out their tongues and hissed whenever the Gorgon stirred in its sleep. As Perseus drew nearer, he saw, reflected in his polished shield, the forms of men and animal that had been turned to stone by one glance of Medusa's hideous face. These men and animal were very numerous around the mouth of the cave, and Perseus silently prayed to the gods that his figure might not be added to that number. Some distance away lay the other two Gorgons, Medusa's sisters, but the young hero had no thought for them. His whole attention was centered on the blow that he must deal the sleeping Medusa before the snakes hissed so loudly that she would awaken. Even in his shield, the sight of that twisting, wriggling mass of reptiles was so repulsive that Perseus shuddered and was tempted to run away. But just then he heard a whisper. Be quick, strike swift and sure. And as he recognized the voice of Mercury, all his courage returned. Grasping his sword more firmly and holding his bright shield above the sleeping monster, he swooped suddenly down upon it, and with one swift stroke cut off the great head with all its coils of serpents. It was only a moment's work to sheath his sword and grasp the hideous trophy in his hands, but even then the danger was not over, for the snakes on Medusa's head began to hiss so loudly that their noise awoke the other two sleeping Gorgons, and they looked around to find why their sister had disturbed their rest. Seeing Medusa's headless body on the sand, they set up such terrible cries that the noise re-echoed like thunder through the cavern, and as far away as Perseus had already flown, he could hear the awful sounds that made the seashore seem like some vision in a dreadful nightmare.